Just a reminder before I start on the lecture, papers are due in 1 week. I know, it sneaks up on you. 1 week from today in Blackboard. So don't forget to submit your papers by midnight, essentially next Tuesday. Are there any questions on the paper? Everyone's good? Okay. Just a reminder, make sure you're citing within the paper as well as at the end of the paper. So any sources you use, make sure you're citing them within the paper as well as at the end of the paper. If it's not your own words, make sure you tell me where it's from. Okay, so make sure you're citing within the paper as well as at the end of the paper. Okay. So I swear I didn't time it the class to line up this perfectly, but it did. Today's lecture is the presidency. One of those weird coincidences. So last week we talked about Congress. Today we're going to talk about the executive branch. And next week we're going to cover the judiciary. So we're heading into the home stretch of the semester. We're going to talk about powers, persuasion, all sorts of fun parts of the presidency. Okay. The presidency, the executive branch, are established as Article 2 of the Constitution. But it wasn't a smooth process. The first debate amongst the founding fathers was, do we want a collective executive or a single leader? And in the end, they decided that they wanted a single leader for stability, decision-making, and energy. If you're deciding by committee, you're not going to get anything done. That's why they went with one president versus 2 or 3. There was also the debate about how to pick the president. Some of the founders wanted the president elected by Congress. Others wanted him directly elected by the people. The Electoral College was supposed to be the compromise. Keeping in mind, of course, all of the issues we see with the Electoral College, it was essentially the happy medium for the founding fathers. And we've also seen changes to how nominees are chosen. First, they were chosen by the members of Congress at the conventions. Then they were chosen by the party leadership. Now they're chosen by us. And it's a relatively new process for picking the presidential nominees. It wasn't until about the 1950s or so that we really saw the use of primaries and caucuses. Prior to that, essentially, the party leadership would meet, get someone high up within the party, and say to the voters, here's your nominee, go vote for him. But this isn't something that's been established from the beginning. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, that the people actually get to pick presidential nominees. Alright, so the president gets his powers through 3 different mechanisms. Expressed powers are the powers that are directly given to the president by the Constitution. So things like making treaties, nominating judges, commanding the military. These are all expressed powers directly given to the president. The only way we could change an expressed power through a constitutional amendment. There are certain powers the president has always had. Implied powers, on the other hand, have grown over time, derived from the necessary and proper clause. The idea that the president will need to extend his powers to be able to do his job. An example of this is that the Constitution gives the president the right to appoint cabinet officials or government officials. But it doesn't say whether or not he has the power to remove them. So in 1926, in the Myers v. United States case, the Supreme Court said it is an implied power of the president that he can fire a cabinet member without needing congressional approval. This is why President Trump could ask Jeff Sessions to resign his office. So he doesn't have the power in the Constitution, but it's considered a necessary power for him to be able to do his job. If he's not happy with the performance of his Attorney General, he's not going to be able to get his job done. The president can also get powers through one branch of government giving power to another. So we'll see this happening when Congress passes a bill and then says to the executive branch, you're in charge of carrying this out. Congress passed the Clean Air Act, then gave responsibility for it to the Environmental Protection Agency. Congress will pass the law, then they'll turn to the executive branch and say, now it's up to you to implement this. We passed a law, you enforce it. Okay, so in terms of expressed powers, those specifically given to the president, he is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He is also the formal head of the CIA, the National Security Council, NSA, and the FBI. Now, each of these agencies has a director, but the president is the formal head of both the military and national intelligence agencies. What this means is that the president can deploy federal troops to states as needed. Usually, he'll wait for a request by a state, but not always. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower put the city of Little Rock under martial law and had the National Guard escort African American students to enforce Brown versus the Board of Education. So he used his power of commander-in-chief to force the school districts to comply. He basically said to the South, you can do this the easy way or the hard way. More recently, after Hurricane Katrina rolled through New Orleans, President Bush sent 22,000 troops to help with rescue efforts, cleanup, and providing supplies. Because the city was very, very decimated. They needed to stop looting, but also to provide clean water, food, blankets, etc. The president can choose not to wait for permission and to send troops in as necessary. It doesn't mean the states always appreciate it. Recently, President Trump sent federal troops to Oregon, and the governor didn't like it. The president also has the power to grant a reprieve, pardon, or amnesty. And this can be to one person or many. At the end of the Civil War, President Andrew Johnson issued a blanket pardon to Southerners who participated in the Confederacy. President Carter issued a blanket amnesty to the young men who didn't show up when their draft number was called in Vietnam. And more controversially, when President Ford took office, he chose to pardon former President Nixon for Watergate. Now, usually these decisions are not controversial. Usually they'll pardon a nonviolent drug offender or someone who's proven they're not going to be a threat. But they can be controversial, like when Chelsea Manning was pardoned by President Obama. The president also has the ability to make treaties, accept ambassadors, and engage in diplomatic relations. President Obama chose to restore diplomatic ties with Cuba in 2015, allowing for Americans to travel to Cuba, reopening the embassy, and so on. Basically saying the Cold War is over. Obviously, the policy of boycotting Cuba isn't working. Let's try to normalize relations. The president can also choose to recognize a government or not. In the 1950s and 60s, the policy of the U.S. government was to recognize the government of Taiwan as the legitimate government of China rather than the Communist Party. In the early 1970s, President Nixon went to China and established a diplomatic relationship recognizing the communist government as legitimate. When South Sudan became an independent country in 2011, President Obama chose to recognize it as a country and accept their ambassadors. So he's also in charge of how we interact with the world, how we interact with foreign leaders, and how we're viewed globally. Now, there are certain powers that the president can exercise, and one of them is called executive privilege. Any confidential communication between the president and his advisors is not to be released to the public unless the president consents. There's a lot of meetings, negotiations, discussions that, quite frankly, we don't need to be privy to. We don't necessarily need to know how they make a decision. There is an exception to this rule, and this is the direct result of the Supreme Court case U.S. v. Nixon. When President Nixon was being investigated by Congress for the Watergate break-in, it came to light that he had a secret tape recording equipment in the Oval Office. He was secretly taping conversations. Congress ordered him to turn over the tapes. He refused, citing executive privilege. The Supreme Court said you can't do that and ordered him to turn over the tapes. If the president is being investigated for illegal activity, he cannot claim executive privilege. If Congress subpoenas him, he better turn over the evidence. The president cannot cite executive privilege if he's part of a criminal investigation. Legislatively, the president does have the power to veto, and we see that happening when we have a divided government. President Bush vetoed 10 bills during his last 2 years as president because Democrats controlled Congress. President Obama vetoed 12 bills during his last 2 years when Republicans controlled Congress. Presidents don't necessarily want to use the veto. It's seen as a sign of weakness. You can't get Congress to do what you want them to do. They try to limit how often they veto. Historically, the veto's been used on over 3,000 bills, and Congress has only overridden the veto 111 times. Again, it takes a 2/3 majority in both chambers to override a veto. So it's pretty rare. But at the same time, the president tries to work with Congress rather than constantly veto legislation. If the president and Congress are of the same party, the president will sometimes present a legislative agenda to Congress and say, here's what I want in the budget. Here's what I see as a priority legislatively. Let's work together on this issue. They don't always get what they want. The idea is at least to get the ball rolling. If the president knows Congress won't work with him on a particular issue, he can issue an executive order. It has the effect of legislation, but it's not permanent. It's only enforceable as long as that president is in office. In 2016, with all the recent mass shootings we've seen, President Obama issued an executive order calling for stricter background checks for guns, and more money for mental health services to try and prevent shootings. He knew he wasn't going to be able to get Congress on board with that, so he issued an executive order, which was then rescinded by President Trump. So the next president can come in and overturn an executive order. It has the effect of legislation as long as the president's in office. Once he leaves, the next president can choose to rescind that. Okay. In terms of delegated powers, Congress can't take care of every program that's created. So they'll turn over responsibility to various parts of the executive branch, different cabinet departments, sub-cabinet departments. And we saw the use of delegated powers increasing when the New Deal programs were created. So many new programs were being created that Congress could not keep up with them. They said to President Roosevelt, we'll create them, and find a way to get them going. And this applies to things like Congress creating the Department of Homeland Security post 9/11. and the fact that the IRS is controlled by congressional tax legislation. So, you may not like the IRS, but to be fair to them, it's not their fault that the tax laws are wonky. It's not their fault that they can't be as flexible as they might want to be. They don't really have control over tax policy. It doesn't have to do with Congress mandates. Some Congress will pass an act and basically just say, you know what, you guys figure out what to do with this. In 1972, Congress passed the Consumer Product Safety Act that authorized a commission to reduce the unreasonable risk of injury from household items. There's no clear definition of what constituted an unreasonable risk or how to reduce this. This is why we get the warnings on hair dryers that you shouldn't use them in the bathtub or not to drink bleach, because there's no clear guidelines for what constitutes an unreasonable risk. There's a pretty famous example that gets misused for this. Have any of you heard of the famous McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit? No? Okay. So in the early 1990s, McDonald's was sued because a woman was burned by their coffee. People misunderstood it that she tried to drink the coffee and it was too hot. What actually happened was she had the cup of coffee in her lap and it spilled all over her and she ended up with third-degree burns on her upper legs and genitals. She actually had to have reconstructive surgery. She talked to McDonald's and said, you know, your coffee's a little too hot. Could you maybe consider, taking it down a notch? And the response from McDonald's was essentially no. She had to sue them if she won. That's why coffee temperatures are regulated. Nobody should get a third-degree burn from coffee. That's ridiculous. That's why coffee temperatures have to be monitored. That's actually an example of a case where legitimately that's a consumer safety issue, not a big one. The Affordable Care Act, because it was so long, most members of Congress didn't fully read it. So they basically said to Health and Human Services, you tell us how it's going to work. We gave you the legislation, you implement it. Which is partly why it took so long to roll out the Affordable Care Act. We had to figure out how to set up the marketplace exchanges, the websites, the tax penalties. It took a while. It didn't help that the website kept crashing for a couple of months because a million people were trying to get on it at the same time. Sometimes Congress will pass the bill and basically say to the executive branch, we don't have the time, the energy, or the interest to deal with this, so you take care of it. There's actually a short documentary about the McDonald's case, and yeah, she was very badly injured, like skin grafts, medical surgeries, injured. All she wanted them to do was pay her medical bills. In the end, they had to pay her a couple $1 million. Just pay the medical bills. They wouldn't have had to, just pay the damn medical bills. That's all I'm saying. Okay. All right. Inherent powers are not explicitly granted by the Constitution, but assumed to be necessary for the President to do his job. So, in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the military, he can make certain decisions in a time of crisis. At the beginning of the Civil War, President Lincoln combined the state militias into a 90-day volunteer force, increased the Army and the Navy, censored the mail, and suspended the right of habeas corpus along the border states. Basically, he said this is a national crisis and I'm going to take steps now. So when Congress came back into session, they retroactively approved all of those decisions. The President can deploy troops without a formal declaration of war from Congress. If the President decides we need to invade Canada, he can go ahead and do so. Probably not the best idea, but technically he can go ahead and do so. Now, there are limits on this. After 60 days, if Congress has not authorized the war, then they have to withdraw the troops. So the wars in Vietnam, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq were started prior to Congress authorizing the wars. Eventually, of course, Congress did approve the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The War Powers Resolution was considered necessary because the government had lied to Congress about the Gulf of Tonkin incident that led to the Vietnam War. Congress wanted to make sure the President couldn't just do whatever he wants. Now, if the President sends troops abroad for 30 days, he doesn't need permission from Congress. And we've had some very short-lived military operations. We were in and out of Grenada in the 80s in less than like 40 days, same with Panama. If we join an international military effort, usually Congress just has to authorize troops being sent abroad. The President has gotten more power over the military with the Patriot Act and the ability for national intelligence to spy on us, and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And so sometimes it's just necessary for the President to use his military powers. On September 11th, President Bush shut down all domestic air travel. All flights were grounded. And that's an inherent power. His job as Commander-in-Chief of the military, he had the right to say, we don't know if this is the end of the attack, so no planes are allowed in the air. And he was allowed to ground the airplanes for a couple of weeks after that, actually. It took a while for them to resume commercial flights. Basically, what they said was any flights that were up in the air on 9/11 after the order to be grounded could be shot down by the military. So all planes had to land at the closest airport, no matter where they were. We actually had a plane that was forced to land in Canada because they were flying along the Canadian border, and that's where they ended up being told to go. They has the right to do that in the name of national security. Okay, so the presidency isn't just an office, it's also an institution. It's part of the executive branch. Another key part of the executive branch is the cabinet. And the cabinet doesn't exist in the Constitution. It's basically just a reality that you're going to have institutions to carry out policy. The president could choose to eliminate a cabinet position or create a new one as necessary. It's why departments like Border Patrol, ICE, and FEMA were rolled into the new Department of Homeland Security because they don't have a formal constitutional status. So each cabinet is headed up by a secretary of education, labor, and so on. Secretaries are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They don't usually know each other prior to their appointments. They don't necessarily work together. You won't see the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Education working together unless there's some cross kind of thing. So they usually only get to know each other when they go to cabinet meetings. They're basically just kind of doing their own thing, which is both good and bad. There's also the National Security Council that includes the President, the Vice President, and the Secretaries of State and Defense. And this is the main foreign policy advisory board. They let the president know what's going on around the world, what's happening in China, or Peru, or Rwanda, so that he knows what's happening globally, and if there's any threats to Americans abroad. There's a White House staff of about 450 different analysts and advisors. The very low-level people tend to roll over from one administration to the next. The staff closely connected to the president, press secretary, speechwriters, and so on, once the president leaves, they do. If you're someone who's a sub-admin assistant, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a job from one administration to the next. There's also the Executive Office of the President that helps with various tasks for the President. One of the main ones is the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB as it's known. This group helps to prepare the budget, report on agency actions, and oversee regulatory proposals. The budget is a top-down process. The OMB talks to the different agencies and sets the terms for the budgets and negotiations. So they'll go to the EPA and they'll say, all right, how much money do you think you need? They'll say, yeah, that's fine, or no, we need to cut that back. And then once they've negotiated their budget and every other agency, they'll give that report to Congress to create the budget for the federal government. So Congress gets that information from the executive branch. The vice presidency, of course, is also part of the executive branch. Constitutionally, the vice president exists for two main reasons. One, to succeed the president should something happen to him. And two, to cast a tiebreaker vote in the Senate as needed. If the Senate deadlocks 50-50, then the vice president casts a tiebreaker vote. Constitutionally, the vice president doesn't have a lot of power. One of FDR's vice presidents said being vice president wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit, which, while somewhat gross, is a pretty apt metaphor. The vice president is important for elections. They're usually chosen to help get the president elected, provide some kind of balance. President John F. Kennedy, being a Northern Catholic Irishman, he needed someone from the South, so he chose Lyndon Johnson, well-liked, well-respected Southern Democrat. And Johnson brought the South with him and helped Kennedy get elected. For President Trump, he wasn't doing very well with evangelicals, so he chose Mike Pence, who is an evangelical, to get them on board. So he'll try to bring someone in to balance the ticket. Older and younger, Northern, Southern, male, possibly female, white, possibly minority. It doesn't always work. With Hillary Clinton, she went the safe route and chose Tim Kaine, a Southern white male Democrat, in an attempt to balance the ticket. It didn't help her, but they at least usually make the effort to try and balance out the ticket. Some vice presidents have been able to shape the office to become more powerful. Dick Cheney was instrumental in the war on terror, getting Congress to authorize the war in Iraq. Sometimes they'll pick a project and they'll run with it. For Vice President Biden, when he was getting towards the end of his time in the Obama administration, he chose to help push for rape kits to be tested faster. In most states, there are statute of limitations on rape cases. But if you file a report and your rape kit isn't tested for 5 years, you can't really do anything about it. So Vice President Biden tried to put more money into speeding up the process so they could analyze rape kits and find out who's responsible. Overall, though, it really is important to have a vice president because, God forbid, sometimes something happens to the president. Historically, 8 vice presidents have become president through death, only one because of the resignation of Richard Nixon. It wasn't until the 25th Amendment in 1965 that constitutionally it was established that the vice president would succeed the president. Prior to that, it was tradition. So when Kennedy was killed in 1963, Johnson took the oath of office on Air Force One. Constitutionally, that didn't exist, but traditionally it did. And there was a lot of controversy around that. Why didn't he wait till he got back to Washington? When the president's just been murdered, he kind of wants some establishment and some order. So it kind of made sense why he took the office. But it's also why, during a time of crisis, they separate the president and the vice president. On 9/11, President Bush was in Florida, Dick Cheney was in Washington, D.C., Vice President Cheney was sent to a bunker, and President Bush was separated from him. You don't want them in the same room for something like that. So it's an important position, but it's not a very powerful one. Okay, first spouse. Obviously, so far we've had nothing but first ladies, although maybe that'll change soon, who knows. They don't tend to be as heavily scrutinized because they're not the ones running for office. So people don't tend to look into their backgrounds as strictly. And it is kind of a largely ceremonial role. White House tours, showing off the Christmas decorations, greeting foreign dignitaries' wives. It's pretty much kind of hand-holding, looking good, decorative position. Some first ladies have decided that's just not quite enough for them. So I would say our most active first lady was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was first lady during the Great Depression and World War II. She pushed for civil rights, got the first woman in a cabinet position. She supported the war effort. And after her husband died, she was part of the U.S. delegation to sign the UN into existence and was one of our first ambassadors to the UN. She also forced newspapers to hire women as journalists because when she held a press conference, she would only talk to female reporters. She actually opened the door for a lot of different people. She was a very, very active First Lady on civil rights, women's rights, and human rights. She was kind of badass. She was actually one of my favorite First Ladies. Hillary Clinton, also a bit more active, but controversial. She tried to get healthcare reform passed. It just couldn't get that. But she wasn't really content to sit on the sidelines. Melania Trump has made history as our first foreign-born First Lady in almost 200 years. If we ever have a first husband, I cannot for the life of me picture them doing a White House tour and talking about the China patterns. I think the role would have to change just a little bit. I was trying to picture former President Clinton, talking about the Christmas decorations. I don't think that was going to happen. But it is interesting because Dr. Jill Biden, who is Joe Biden's wife, she's an English professor at a community college, and she's already said if her husband happens to win, she still wants to work. She still wants to be a college professor. So she may be one of the only First Ladies that will actually have another job, which would definitely be groundbreaking in some ways. So we'll see. Right? We don't know. We'll have to see. Okay, obviously the presidency can't exist in a vacuum. They have to get the public on board with their agenda. We'll try to reach out to the public by going on the news networks, doing interviews, talking to the public. They have to campaign for office. They have to go from state to state, make appearances at colleges, state fairs, diners, kissing babies, shaking hands. All of that's part of the job. They want the public on board with their legislative agenda. Part of the reason the Affordable Care Act has not yet been overturned is because the American people have said, don't kick me off of my healthcare plan unless you have a better one in mind. So they've been letting their Congress members know, I don't want this repealed. And that does put pressure on them not to try to repeal it. And it was FDR who became the first president to really make use of the media. Prior to FDR, for the most part, people really only saw or heard the president in the newsreels that would play before a movie. FDR used the radio to do a chat where he would talk about the programs and policies, what they were doing about the Great Depression, and so on. And people said it sounded like he was sitting in their living room talking. He was the first president that people really heard from on a regular basis. To know what he sounded like. To feel like he was talking directly to them. He was also the first president to hold a bi-weekly press conference to talk about policy and answer questions. It's because of him that there are presidential press conferences. There's a White House communications office that usually holds press conferences, this administration being a bit of an outlier on that. But usually they will answer questions, respond to negative publicity, policy. Usually it's a little bit better relationship between the White House and the press. Not always great, but usually a little better. We saw an increase in the use of the internet by the Obama administration, using Twitter and Facebook, and creating the We the People website. The We the People website basically allowed anyone to start a petition. If it got 100,000 signatures, and that petition went to a White House staffer for review, the people could make suggestions to the White House. And it was pretty cool. It gave the people a chance to kind of say, hey, here's what we want from you guys. President Obama also reportedly had a very hard time giving his BlackBerry to Secret Service. He's a bit of a technophile, and he had a hard time giving it up. President Trump, of course, has used Twitter. We've all seen how that's worked out. But yeah, he's been pretty busy on Twitter. And presidents know that Americans are fickle. One day we love the president, the next day we want him out of office. And the reality is popular support can rise and fall very quickly. President George W. Bush, he had a little over a 90% approval rating right after 9/11. But it's one thing to see the president at ground zero. It's another thing to see him back at work in the White House. He did enjoy a 70% approval rating for a year after 9/11. Then when his administration botched the response to Hurricane Katrina, his support dropped to 39%. President Obama entered office with 76% approval rating. In the fall of 2014, with the government shutdowns and everything, it dropped to 36%. So inevitably, it goes up, it goes down. President Trump has never had an approval rating above 50%, which is rare. Usually they hit at least 60, 70% at some point. He never has, which is, again, kind of different than usual. The reality is, some days the public loves you, some days they hate you. The presidents just have to deal with that. They're never going to make everyone happy all of the time. So you just got to kind of take it as part of the job. There's a couple of different things the president can do in terms of administrative strategies. The president can use regulatory review. This is where he will try to control an agency and make them implement a new rule or regulation. President Obama straightened out overtime pay for federal workers, asked the EPA to look at pollution issues, and very importantly, had the Department of Education shut down state colleges. Schools like ITT Tech and others were promising you a degree in return for attending, but people were paying thousands of dollars and not getting the degree. And some of them were not properly accredited. Basically, they just existed to make a profit. So those colleges have been shut down, because they're basically taking people's money and they were getting nothing in return. So things like that tend to help the American people out. Again, the president can use an executive order. President Truman used an executive order to desegregate the military. President Roosevelt used it for the internment of Japanese Americans, which, as we have discussed, was one of the biggest civil liberties violations in American history. President Nixon used an executive order to create the Environmental Protection Agency, and President Theodore Roosevelt used it to create the Food and Drug Administration. Have any of you read a book called The Jungle by Sinclair Lewis? No? I think that's the one where, that was the one where he was investigating like slaughterhouses and things like that. And it was because of him exposing how dirty, quite frankly, disgusting and terrible these places were. Yeah. It's because of that that we actually have the Food and Drug Administration, that there's safety protocols where it can't be like leaving cuts on the floor and stuff like that. Also where they regulate drugs. Because, for example, when Prozac first came out, everybody thought it was a great wonder drug for depression, until they realized that it can actually increase suicidal thoughts. You gotta look at stuff like that and fix it, right? You don't want those drugs out on the market and causing all sorts of chaos. Congress can push back on an executive order. So the first so-called Muslim ban by President Trump was challenged in federal court and struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So he had to redo the executive order. An executive order can be overturned by the Supreme Court or a federal judge. So if Congress or a state thinks the president's going too far, they can get an executive order overturned. So they're not infallible. The president can also choose to show what he thinks about a law or choose not to enforce part of a law. Sometimes the president sent a bill where Congress knows he absolutely has to sign it into law, but they include something he doesn't like. The president can show, I'm signing this bill because it's necessary, but I don't agree with this. For President Obama, he signed a bill that included a provision that he would have to notify Congress prior to transferring prisoners out of Guantanamo Bay. And he said, that's unconstitutional, I'm not enforcing it. Because in his role as commander in the military, he has control over the military bases. Therefore, Congress can't force him to tell them if he's doing something with the military base. In that sense, he was actually right. And he was able to say, I'm signing this bill, but you can't force me to abide by this part of it. They can signal their opposition, and they can say, this bill is important, but I don't like this, and I'm letting the American people know that the only reason I signed this bill was because of this part and this part. Again, executive orders are only enforceable as long as the president is in office. So if, hypothetically, Biden wins tonight, he can choose to rescind the Muslim ban. He can choose to say, I'm not enforcing this executive order anymore. It's not like the president is a god, right? There are limits on what he can do. Obviously, if the government shuts down, that's a problem. And in 2018, when the government shut down because the president wanted more money for the border wall and Congress said no, people will sometimes blame the president. And they'll say, find a way to negotiate with Congress and get the country back up and running. We have to work with Congress. They can't always get what they want. Congress can choose to push back. And there's also only so much the president can do about the economy. He can regulate the banks, he can regulate Wall Street, but if they find loopholes or a company goes under, there's not much he can do about that. There's not much you can do about a company that's breaking the law if nobody's really paying attention to it. When the economy isn't doing well, we tend to look to the president to fix it, but there's only so much the president can do. When the economy collapsed in 2008, President Obama did everything he could to get it back up and running. It still took the better part of 2-3 years to get it to work. Right? It's not an instantaneous fix. It can't magically restore the economy. There are also limited if it's a divided government. Democrats in the House are talking to Republicans in the Senate who aren't talking to the president. Legislation is being held up. The president knows that if he tries to introduce a certain bill in the House, it will never get anywhere. So if the presidency is controlled by one party and Congress by another, not much we can do about that. Overall, the president does have more power today than originally intended. The president wasn't supposed to be so pressured by the American people. He's supposed to be removed from politics. Obviously, that's not the case. He wasn't supposed to have as much control over policy. Obviously, not the case. So, since the 1930s, the president has become more powerful, more involved with the American people, and more beholden to us. And that's not the way it was intended to be, but that's the way it is. The president relies on the American people. They can't operate in a vacuum. They can't ignore us. They can't just do whatever they want. I've come up with about 4 or 5 different scenarios for how I think tonight could play out. 1, Biden wins in a landslide. 2, Trump wins in a landslide. 3, it's close for either candidate. 4, Biden wins the presidency, Democrats control the House but not the Senate. 5, Democrats take control of all parts of the government. 6, Trump wins but Democrats control the House and the Senate. That's like playing musical chairs. Pick the president, pick the form of government we're going to have. I really don't think we're going to know who won tonight. I don't think it's going to happen. North Carolina, they've already said in some places they're keeping the polls open an extra 45 minutes because they got late in terms of opening. And in some places, if there's problems with the technology, they are going to have to stay open late. And the rule is, if you're in line to vote when the polls close, you still have to be given the right to vote. If you go to vote in Mercedes at 6 p.m. and you're still in line at 7 when the polls close, legally, they have to let you vote. So some of the polling places may not close till 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. Because if the lines are long enough, you cannot turn someone away who showed up before the polls close. If you're in line, stay in line. Yes, Leonel. Do you have a question, Leonel? Maybe not. Okay, so again, if you haven't voted today and you're in line, stay in line. They have to give you the right to vote. In 2012, it took Florida until almost 11 p.m. to finish counting all the ballots because it took them forever to sort out Miami-Dade and Broward counties. They couldn't call the state until they had those 2 counties. So don't be surprised if we don't know who won because they're still counting the votes well into tomorrow in some states. One thing I do find interesting is how close it's going to be in Texas. I don't think Texas is going to go Biden, but it might be close. If it's close, then Texas could become a battleground state in 4 years. If Biden somehow wins Texas tonight, you better believe there's going to be a lot of discussion about tech politics going forward. And a lot of people having to rethink what they believe about Texas politics. So we could become a swing state after tonight if it's a very close vote. There's also, of course, Senate seats up for election and the House. Democrats want to control all 3. It's likely they'll hold on to the House. I don't know if they'll take back control of the Senate. There's a couple of Senate seats that are too close to call, and we won't know until later who actually won. This is one of those weird elections where we're not necessarily going to know who won tonight. So Thursday, I'd set aside the day to discuss the election. If we still don't know what happened, or you guys are just like, I'm sick of it, let's move on, we'll talk about the making of the modern presidency instead. So either way, there's no reading for Thursday. Either we'll discuss the election or we'll discuss the making of the modern presidency. Remember that your paper is due 1 week from today in Blackboard. Any questions on any of that? Everyone's good? Okay. So if you haven't voted, please go vote. Stay safe, be careful out there. People may get crazy. So please just be careful out there, okay?